Have you ever witnessed something so pure, so unexpected, that it shook you to your core? Welcome to Stories of Hope. Today you're about to hear a story that will touch your heart in ways you never imagined. Before we begin, let me ask you, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from you. It was a crisp autumn afternoon in downtown Chicago. The streets were bustling with life, people hurrying by, cars honking, the scent of roasted peanuts floating from street vendors. Amid all the noise and chaos, Thomas Grant, a man whose fortune could fill skyscrapers, sat quietly inside his sleek black limousine, gazing absent-mindedly out the tinted window. Thomas wasn't just any millionaire. He had built his empire from scratch, rising from a modest background to one of the wealthiest men in the city. Yet with all his success, life had dealt him one cruel hand. His only son, Matthew, was born with a condition that left him unable to walk. No amount of money, no amount of specialists or therapy had been able to change that. Matthew was confined to his wheelchair, and despite the love Thomas showered on him, he could never shake the feeling that he had somehow failed his boy. That afternoon, Thomas had decided to take Matthew for some fresh air in the city park. It wasn't something he did often, mostly because he hated the pitying stares from strangers. But today, something had pushed him to step out of his guarded world. They were sitting by a fountain when Thomas stepped away for a few minutes to take a call. It was supposed to be quick, just a business deal he couldn't ignore. But when he returned, he froze in his tracks. There, beside Matthew's wheelchair, was a young girl, no older than 8 or 9, dressed in clothes so tattered and worn that Thomas's chest tightened just looking at her. Her hair was messy, her hands were smudged with dirt, and her shoes were barely holding together. It was clear she was one of the countless homeless children scattered across the city streets. What stunned Thomas wasn't just her appearance, it was what she was doing. The girl was gently coaxing Matthew out of his wheelchair, holding his hands firmly but kindly, encouraging him to take small, wobbly steps toward her. Her voice was soft but strong, filled with a strange kind of wisdom beyond her years. "You can do it," she whispered. "Don't be scared. I'll catch you." Matthew's face was lit up with a kind of hope Thomas hadn't seen in years. Not the forced smiles for doctors or the polite nods for therapists. This was real, raw, alive. Thomas felt his throat tighten. His instinct was to rush over, to pull his son away, to shield him from potential harm. But something deep inside him, held him back. He watched instead, unable to move, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. Matthew took a shaky step, then another. The girl caught him when he faltered, laughing softly, encouraging him like a big sister would. For a brief moment, the wheelchair didn't exist. The diagnosis didn't exist. It was just a boy, trying to walk, and a girl who believed he could. Thomas finally forced himself to move closer, every step heavy with emotion he didn't quite understand. When he was just a few feet away, he saw something that made his knees almost buckle. The girl's face, behind the dirt and the worn clothes, was tear-streaked. Not tears of pity, tears of pure, selfless joy. As if helping Matthew walk, even for a few seconds, was the greatest gift she could ever receive. Thomas dropped to his knees, unable to keep the emotions bottled up any longer. His eyes stung, and for the first time in decades, he let the tears fall freely. He knelt there, next to the girl and his son, in the middle of a busy park where no one seemed to notice or care. But to him, that small corner of the world had just shifted forever. The girl looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes and simply said, "He's stronger than he thinks. You just have to believe in him." Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could he explain to a little girl that she had just taught him more about strength, about love, than all the wealth and doctors in the world ever could. As the sun dipped lower into the horizon, casting a golden glow over the fountain, Thomas knew one thing for certain: his life, and Matthew's, would never be the same again. But he had no idea yet who this mysterious little girl truly was, or how deeply she would end up changing everything. Thomas sat quietly on the park bench, Matthew leaning against him, his tiny legs trembling from the small steps he had just taken. The little girl stood a few feet away, hesitant now, as if unsure whether she was allowed to stay or should slip back into the sea of strangers who barely noticed her existence. Thomas wiped his face quickly, embarrassed by his own tears. He patted the bench beside him, inviting her to sit. She looked around nervously, clutching a small tattered bag to her chest, before taking cautious steps toward them. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Thomas asked gently, his voice still thick with emotion. "Annie," she said, almost in a whisper. "Annie May." "That's a beautiful name," Thomas replied, offering a warm smile. "I'm Thomas, and this little guy is my son, Matthew." Matthew beamed at Annie, reaching out his small hand, which she shook shyly. In that simple moment, it felt as if they had known each other forever. Thomas wanted to ask her 1,000 questions: where she came from, why she was out here alone, how she had learned to help someone walk with such gentle patience. But something about the way Annie looked down at her worn shoes told him to tread carefully. This was a child who had learned that trust was not freely given. Instead, he asked, "Are you hungry?" Annie hesitated, pride flickering across her dirty face. But when her stomach growled audibly, she gave a small nod, almost ashamed. Thomas flagged down a hot dog vendor and bought 3 hot dogs with extra ketchup, just the way Matthew liked them. When he handed one to Annie, she took it with both hands like it was a treasure, whispering a soft, "Thank you," before biting into it, hungrily. They sat there, eating in silence, the noise of the park fading into a gentle hum around them. Thomas watched Annie closely. She was so small, so fragile, yet there was a fire in her eyes that spoke of battles fought long before childhood should demand them. After a while, when the sun had almost dipped below the skyline and the evening chill began to creep in, Thomas knew he couldn't just leave her there, not without knowing more. "Where are your parents, Annie?" he asked, keeping his voice soft. Annie stiffened. She wiped her hands on her threadbare dress and stared out at the fountain. For a long moment, Thomas thought she wouldn't answer. "My mama got sick," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Real sick. We didn't have money for doctors. She went to heaven last winter." Thomas felt a pang so deep he had to grip the edge of the bench to steady himself. "And your father?" he asked, although he already feared the answer. Annie shook her head. "Don't know him. Mama said he left before I was born." Silence hung heavy between them. Thomas struggled to find the right words, but what could he possibly say? No child should ever have to carry such a story. "Where are you staying?" he managed. "Sometimes. Shelters," Annie said, shrugging. "But they're full a lot, so wherever I can, mostly here. People don't look too hard at kids like me." Thomas felt his heart twist painfully. All his life, he had been surrounded by walls, thick, impenetrable walls that kept people like Annie out. Not out of cruelty, but out of convenience, out of comfort. He had lived at the top of the world, blind to the small souls scraping by just beneath his feet. Matthew, unaware of the heaviness between the adults, tugged on Annie's sleeve. "You're my friend now," he said solemnly. "Right?" Annie's face lit up in a way that no hot dog, no words of kindness could have achieved. She nodded fiercely, smiling so brightly it was as if the sun had come back up just for her. Thomas watched them and made a decision without even realizing it. It wasn't a business deal. It wasn't a calculated move. It was instinct, pure and simple. "Annie," he said carefully, "would you like to come home with us? Just for tonight. A warm bed, some clean clothes, real food." Annie froze. Her big eyes widened, darting back and forth as if expecting someone to jump out and tell her it was a cruel trick. "You don't have to," Thomas added quickly. "Only if you want to." She bit her lip, staring at the ground for so long that Thomas's heart broke all over again. Finally, she gave a tiny nod. "Just for tonight," she said softly. "If it's really okay." Thomas smiled and ruffled her hair. "It's more than okay." As they made their way back to the limousine, Thomas carrying Matthew and Annie clutching his free hand tightly, he felt something shift deep within him. It wasn't just charity, it wasn't pity, it was something far greater. It was hope, for Matthew, for Annie, maybe even for himself. As the limousine pulled away from the curb, none of them noticed the pair of dark, watchful eyes following them from the shadows of the park. Eyes that would soon bring new challenges none of them could have ever predicted. The ride home was quiet, but filled with an unspoken warmth. Matthew rested his head on Annie's shoulder, and for the first time in a long while, Annie allowed herself to relax. Thomas stole a glance at them from across the car, feeling a heaviness lift from his chest he didn't even know he was carrying. When they reached the grand estate Thomas called home, Annie hesitated at the massive front doors. She looked up at the towering stone pillars, the endless rows of windows, the manicured gardens stretching as far as her eyes could see. It was like stepping into another world, one she had only ever seen in dreams. Thomas kneeled beside her. "It's just a house, Annie. It's the people inside that make it a home, and right now, you're part of that." Annie gave a small, trembling smile and followed him inside. The housekeeper, Maria, came rushing to greet them, but stopped short when she saw Annie. Her eyes widened slightly, but one look at Thomas's face told her everything she needed to know. Without a word, Maria offered Annie a soft smile and took her tiny hand. "Let's get you cleaned up, sweetheart," she said warmly. "We'll find you some cozy clothes." Annie glanced back at Thomas, who gave her an encouraging nod before disappearing down the hall with Maria. As Thomas carried Matthew up the stairs to his room, his mind raced. He knew he was making decisions faster than he usually would. He was a man who spent days, weeks, analyzing every deal, weighing every risk. But this wasn't business. This was heart. Later that night, Thomas found himself standing outside the guest room where Annie was staying. He heard laughter, real, pure laughter, from inside. Carefully, he peeked in. Annie sat cross-legged on the bed, wearing one of Maria's old nightgowns that nearly swallowed her tiny frame. Matthew was beside her, holding a stack of books. She was reading to him, her voice animated and full of wonder, bringing the characters to life in a way Thomas hadn't seen in years. He leaned against the doorframe, feeling something warm and unfamiliar spread through him. Maybe it was gratitude, maybe it was something deeper. The next few days passed in a blur of joy Thomas hadn't realized he was missing. Annie moved through the house like she belonged there, helping Maria with chores, playing with Matthew, filling the empty rooms with life. But in the quiet moments, Thomas noticed shadows flicker across Annie's face, a glance over her shoulder, a hesitation before opening a door, as if she was always expecting someone or something to snatch it all away. One evening, after dinner, Thomas found Annie sitting alone in the garden, staring up at the stars. "Can't sleep?" he asked, sitting beside her. She shook her head. "It's too nice here, feels like a dream, and dreams don't last." Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat. Sometimes, Annie, the best dreams are the ones we fight to keep. She didn't say anything, but her small hand found his, squeezing it tightly. Just as Thomas felt hope settling into his bones, the past Annie had tried so hard to outrun came crashing back into their lives. It started with the phone call. Maria answered it, frowning as she handed the phone to Thomas. "It's someone asking about a missing girl. Says he's her uncle." Thomas's heart sank. He glanced over at Annie and Matthew, giggling in the living room, building a fort out of couch cushions. He pressed the phone to his ear. "This is Thomas Carter," he said. The voice on the other end was gruff, almost greasy. "Yeah, name's Donnie. Annie May's my niece. She's been missing. We've been worried sick." Thomas's instincts prickled immediately. There was no worry in Donnie's voice, only impatience, and something darker lurking underneath. "How did you know to call here?" Thomas asked carefully. "Heard she was seen with some rich guy. Figured you'd do the right thing and bring her back. Family's family after all." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I'll need proof, paperwork, custody documents. You understand." There was a long pause, then a cold chuckle. "Yeah, sure. We'll bring whatever you need." The line went dead. Thomas stared at the phone, a knot twisting in his stomach. He knew he had to find out more, fast, because every instinct screamed that Annie was not safe with whoever was on the other end of that line, and he was right. The next evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a beat-up pickup truck rumbled down the long driveway toward the house. Two rough-looking men climbed out, their eyes scanning the property hungrily. Thomas stood on the porch, arms crossed, heart pounding. Behind him, hidden safely inside, Maria kept Annie and Matthew out of sight. "Mr. Carter," one of the men sneered, tipping his greasy cap. "We're here for Annie." Thomas stayed calm, but his fists clenched at his sides. "You'll need to show me legal custody papers before anything happens." The taller man smirked. "We ain't here for no paperwork. We're here to take what's ours." Before Thomas could react, one of them lunged forward, but the security guards Thomas had quietly stationed around the property after the phone call stepped out of the shadows, guns drawn. The men froze. "You need to leave," Thomas said, his voice low and dangerous. "Annie isn't going anywhere with you. Not now. Not ever." The men cursed and spat, but under the steely gaze of the guards they backed away, retreating to their truck and roaring back down the driveway, tires spinning in the gravel. Thomas exhaled slowly, his entire body trembling with adrenaline. He turned back toward the house and saw Annie standing in the doorway, her face pale, her small body shaking. "You're safe, Annie," he said, walking over and kneeling before her. "I promise you, no one's ever going to hurt you again." Annie threw herself into his arms, sobbing into his chest, and in that moment, Thomas realized something profound. He hadn't saved Annie. She had saved them. She had brought laughter back into a house filled with sorrow. She had reminded a lonely man and his son what love looked like, what courage felt like, and he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never had to be afraid again. The following weeks were a quiet healing for them all. No more phone calls, no more threats. Thomas had used every resource at his disposal to ensure that Annie would never have to live in fear again. The authorities uncovered that the men who had claimed to be Annie's family were in fact exploiting children like her, using them to beg, to steal, to survive on the streets while they pocketed whatever they could. Annie had never known real family, but now, for the first time, she had one. Mornings became filled with new routines. Annie and Matthew having breakfast together, laughing over silly jokes, competing to see who could finish their pancakes first. Thomas would sit across from them, just watching, letting the warmth of those simple moments soak into a heart that had been lonely for far too long. One afternoon, Thomas took Annie and Matthew to the park. It was a crisp fall day, the leaves painted gold and red by the changing season. The wheelchair sat forgotten near the bench as Matthew, with shaky but determined steps, walked hand in hand with Annie along the winding path. Thomas followed slowly behind, his heart full. At one point, Matthew turned back toward his father, his face glowing with excitement. "Look, Dad, I'm walking!" Thomas could barely see through the tears welling in his eyes. He knelt on the path, arms wide open, and Matthew stumbled into them, laughing breathlessly. Annie watched them with a soft smile, a smile far too wise for someone her age. Later that evening, as the fireplace crackled in the living room and the soft hum of home filled the air, Thomas called Annie over to him. He held a small box in his hand. Annie looked at it, puzzled. "What's that?" Thomas smiled warmly. "It's something special, something I should have given you the day you stepped into our lives." She opened the box carefully. Inside was a delicate gold necklace with a tiny heart-shaped locket. Thomas cleared his throat, emotions threatening to choke him. "Inside that locket," he said gently, "is a picture of all three of us, because you're family now, Annie, if you want to be." Annie's hands trembled as she lifted the necklace out of the box. Her eyes filled with tears she couldn't hold back. "I want to," she whispered, her voice shaking. Thomas fastened the necklace around her neck, and in that simple moment, a new chapter began, not bound by blood, but by something even stronger: love, true, selfless love. As the days turned into months, Annie flourished. She attended school, made friends, and chased dreams she once thought were only for other children. Matthew, too, grew stronger. Each step he took a testament to the bond they shared. And Thomas, once a man lost in grief, found his purpose again through the two children who had saved his soul. Every night, before turning in, Annie would touch the little locket resting against her heart, whisper a thank you to the stars, and fall asleep, knowing she was finally safe, finally loved. And Thomas? He would stand by the doorway of their rooms, listening to the soft sounds of their breathing, feeling a peace he never thought he would find again. It's funny, he often thought, how the most beautiful things in life come when you least expect them. Sometimes, hope doesn't come with fanfare. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of a small, brave girl on a cold sidewalk, teaching a boy in a wheelchair to walk again. And sometimes, if you're lucky enough to open your heart, it changes everything. Thank you for being a part of this beautiful story here on Stories of Hope. If this story touched your heart even a little, please don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share this story with someone who might need a little hope today. We'll see you again soon with more stories that remind us of the goodness still left in this world.